He is a serial killer who has brutally murdered 17 victims and has been the subject of TV series and movies all over the world. In addition, he collects the organs of his victims, keeps them in his refrigerator, tastes them, experiments on them, and tries to turn them into zombies that he can control. He is Jeffrey Dahmer, the Milwaukee Cannibal, one of the world's most dangerous serial killers. Welcome to the Crime Engineers channel. Here, we will be discussing crime cases about serial killers and murders, and with your comments and thoughts, we will look at the events from a different perspective. Before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell and support us to get a closer look at the mystery of the next crime case. By the way, I have included a full list of Jeffrey Dahmer's victims at the end of the video. I recommend you watch the video to the end. Jeffrey Dahmer was born on May 27, 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, USA. Dahmer's early childhood was normal, but later he became asocial and timid. At this age, he was interested in collecting dead animals, but this was not a concern because his father, Lionel Herbert Dahmer, was a chemist and it was thought that little Jeffrey would follow in his father's footsteps. In 1966, after finishing his PhD, his father Lionel found a job and the family moved to Ohio and then to a new house in 1967. Meanwhile, the mother, Joyce, was pregnant with little David. Jeffrey was more sympathetic to the new neighborhood they had just moved to. He even made friends with a boy named Lee from next door and liked going to school. However, Mother Joyce had a psychological crisis after giving birth and had constant arguments with Father Lionel. This affected Jeffrey a lot. In 1977, his parents decided to divorce, which opened the door to difficult times for Jeffrey. Although Jeffrey was known to have never killed an animal, his fascination with dead animals was obvious. It is said that when he was still in high school, he drove a stake through the head of a dead dog and planted it in the garden. He would separate the skin from the bones and bury them in his own pet cemetery. Becoming increasingly withdrawn and strange, Jeffrey started drinking alcohol in high school and soon became an alcoholic. He even drank to school. Jeffrey never had a girlfriend. Because he was gay, he had a weakness for black men and he had abnormal sexual fantasies about them. He wanted to dominate the men he fantasized about. Durf Bachter, a high school classmate of Jeffrey Dahmer's, wrote in his 2012 comic book, My Friend Dahmer, that Jeffrey was obsessed with a jogger and wanted to dominate him. Jeffrey imagined killing the runner and lying next to him. However, Jeffrey was never able to realize this scenario. In 1978, Jeffrey Dahmer was 18 years old and his first victim was an 18-year-old hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks. Jeffrey gave Stephen a lift and offered to go home and have a drink with him. Stephen accepted the offer and went to Jeffrey's house where he lived with his father. When they got home, no one was home. Jeffrey and Stephen had a beer together and started chatting. After drinking their beers, Jeffrey asked Stephen to have sexual intercourse with him, but Stephen refused and wanted to leave the house. Jeffrey was furious and hit Stephen over the head with a 5-pound dumbbell he had in the house and killed him on the spot. Jeffrey had to dispose of the body before his father came home. He quickly dismembered the body in the bathtub and buried it in the garden of his house. In a quieter time he would dig up the body, pulverize it with a sledgehammer and acid, and sprinkle it in the garden. Jeffrey Dahmer was charged in 1981 with disturbing the public peace and drunk driving. His father took this into account and sent Jeffrey to live with his grandmother in Wisconsin. After his first murder, everything was quiet for Jeffrey. He had even joined the army, but was soon discharged due to alcoholism and returned to the city. Jeffrey Dahmer would commit his second murder in 1987, 9 years later. He and Stephen Twomey, whom he had met in a gay bar, went to a hotel together and Dahmer woke up in the morning to find Stephen Twomey's lifeless body next to him, not remembering anything. Jeffrey Dahmer had broken Tommy's ribs and punched him to death. After waking up, he packed the body in a large suitcase and left the hotel with it. Arriving at his grandmother's house with the body in a suitcase, Jeffrey had sexual intercourse with the corpse in the basement. He then dismembered the body and disposed of it by throwing it in a dumpster. It was his first time having sexual intercourse with a dead person and he enjoyed it. He also enjoyed killing. In addition to racism, borderline personality disorder, psychosis and schizotypal personality disorder, Jeffrey Dahmer began to show signs of necrophilia. Jeffrey Dahmer continued to commit murders intermittently. His third victim was a 14-year-old boy named James Dockstader, whom he met in a gay bar. In 1988, Richard Guerrero of Mexican origin was his next victim. He met him in a gay bar, took him home and killed him, sometimes having sexual intercourse with the dead, sometimes masturbating in front of him. Jeffrey's grandmother was unaware of everything, but she became disturbed by the men coming to the house, Jeffrey's noises and the strong odor. Realizing this, Jeffrey moved into his own house in 1990, planning to use it as a new murder base. But after moving in, he found himself in court. He had tricked a little boy into taking pictures of him for $50, but he molested the boy and let him go. I suggest you pay attention here. Because after this boy told his parents, they filed a criminal complaint against Jeffrey, and the boy was the brother of one of Jeffrey's later victims, Connor Synthesumphone. That was a really big coincidence. After the Laotian boy and his family pressed charges, Jeffrey Dahmer pleaded guilty to molestation, but the trial was postponed to determine the sentence. On the morning of May 27, 1991, two young women found a 14-year-old boy on the street, naked, drugged and bleeding from his rectum. These two young women called 911. The boy was Connor, the brother of the Laotian boy. Jeffrey Dahmer appeared on the scene and attempted to take this semi-conscious child by force. Dahmer told the police that Connor was staying at his house, that he was his friend and that they had argued and fought. Despite the two young women's best efforts, the police returned the child to Dahmer. Dahmer killed Connor Synthesumphone that night and separated his skull from his body and kept it as a souvenir. Jeffrey Dahmer also trapped Anthony Sears in 1991. Anthony, who had met Jeffrey Dahmer in a gay bar, was a model and accepted Jeffrey's request to take photos at his home in exchange for money. It was to be the worst decision Anthony had ever made in his life. He would soon be strangled to death in Jeffrey's home after being drugged. Jeffrey Dahmer had sexual intercourse with Anthony Sears' body and dismembered it. Jeffrey Dahmer, like other serial killers from time to time, had a desire to take souvenirs from his victims and he wanted the skull of Anthony, one of his known victims. He heated the skull, separated the flesh from the bones, painted it gray and made it look like a model. That way, the skull would be close at hand and not draw attention to itself. A court verdict was announced for the Laotian boy, but Jeffrey's brilliant acting saved him. Jeffrey would receive psychological support, go to work during the day for a year and spend the evenings in a detention center. Moreover, his offense was suspended for 5 years. A few days later he was released for good behavior. This was a reward for Jeffrey Dahmer. Moreover, his father, Lionel, had written to the judge asking him not to let him out until he had recovered. But Dahmer was free to do what he wanted. Jeffrey Dahmer came to his home at number 213 North 23rd Street. During his stay in this house he killed 12 people, and only 6 of the murders took place in May and July 1991. Jeffrey Dahmer, who has 17 known murders, has confessed to lobotomizing his victims. He would put his victims to sleep with an overdose of drugs, drill their heads with a drill and inject them with a chemical liquid using a syringe. Thus, he tried to turn his victims into zombies. Jeffrey Dahmer, who had a fascination with dead animals, homosexual fantasy scenarios and many victims when he was young, had turned into a killing machine and a monster. Jeffrey's victims were mostly young black men he met in gay bars. In exchange for money, he would offer to take their photographs or have a drink at his home. He would drug his victims into a semi-conscious or lethargic state. It was common for him to dismember the bodies. He had a Polaroid camera, so he could take pictures of his victims and keep them as souvenirs. He didn't forget to keep the head or any of the organs of his victims. One day he even took the skull of his murder victim with him to work. He sometimes tasted the body parts, sometimes hid them, sometimes had sexual intercourse with them, and sometimes masturbated looking at them. In his confessions, Jeffrey also said that he ate the flesh of his victims. In this way, he believed that his victims would one day be born inside him, and when he was caught, a large amount of human flesh was found in the refrigerator at his home, proving these confessions. In his interviews with reporters after his capture, Jeffrey was very calm and professional. On July 22, 1991, at around 11 p.m., police patrols spotted a strange man stumbling down the road, half naked, with handcuffs on his left wrist. This man's name was Tracy Edwards. He had escaped, was waiting for help, and would have been Jeffrey Dahmer's 18th victim if he hadn't. At that very moment, there was another man near the Oxford apartment building, watching the cops and this strange man in a state of exhaustion. This man was Jeffrey Dahmer himself. It was as if Jeffrey knew what was about to happen next. He was keeping his cool despite everything, but this time his coolness would not save him. Jeffrey Dahmer would soon be captured and go down in world history as the Milwaukee Cannibal, and one of the world's most dangerous serial killers. Tracy Edwards showed the cops Jeffrey's house, and when the cops came home they saw photos of dead bodies, dead human organs, skulls in the bedroom. This was reason enough to arrest Jeffrey. Jeffrey resisted at first, but in vain. In apartment 213, where Jeffrey Dahmer was found, 74 Polaroid photos of bodies, 1 scalp, 2 hands, 2 penises, 2 complete skeletons, 2 hearts, 3 fused human bodies, 7 skulls and 1 biceps muscle. All these body parts were kept clean and carefully stored. So much so that forensics at the time likened the house to a museum. Jeffrey Dahmer confessed to all his crimes in court on July 13, 1992, and said that he had committed the murders out of insanity. But prosecutors and judges tried to be very meticulous. So much so that jurors who were thought to belittle homosexuals were eliminated. But 13 of the 14 jurors selected were white, whereas most of Jeffrey's victims were black. Relatives of the victims even protested against this. Jeffrey's lawyer was trying to convince the court that Jeffrey was insane. At the same time, detectives were reading Jeffrey Dahmer's 160-page confession in court. When these confessions were read, there was a great silence in the court. These confessions that were read out were just atrocities.
I hated no one. I knew I was sick or evil or both. Now I believe I was sick. The doctors have told me about my sickness, and now I have some peace.
Jeffrey Dahmer was sentenced to 16 life sentences and sent to Columbia Prison. At first he was in solitary confinement. Later his sentence was commuted. In prison, Jeffrey joined a cleaning crew that included 2 other inmates. One was Jesse Anderson, a white man who had brutally murdered his wife and tried to frame a black man for the crime. Another member of the cleaning crew was Christopher Scarver, a young black man convicted of murder. Christopher Scarver also claimed that he was the Messiah and that he spoke to God. On November 28, 1991, a cleaning crew of these inmates was assigned to clean the prison ward's gymnasium. They had been assigned by the guards and were left alone in the gym for a short time to do their work. Christopher Scarver took advantage of this and, with the help of a cleaning stick, first attacked Jesse Anderson and incapacitated him. Scarver then approached Jeffrey Dahmer and started hitting him on the head with the iron bar of a dumbbell. Dahmer had trauma to his skull and brain and was bleeding profusely. Both prisoners were hospitalized shortly afterwards. Jesse Anderson died 2 days later and Jeffrey Dahmer died the same day. Jeffrey Dahmer received countless love letters and marriage proposals while in prison. He became an idol for people with similar criminal and psychological problems. The news of his death was like a bombshell around the world. Christopher Scarver was seen as a hero, especially by the relatives of the victims, and was talked about by everyone. But this was not enough for Dahmer to be forgotten. In my first video, I talked about the murder and crime profile of Jeffrey Dahmer, one of the best-known serial killers in the world. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell and comment to be notified of the next video.